We are in very meaningful discussions with the Democrats, and I think the Republicans are very unified. We are very strong on our Second Amendment. The Democrats are not strong at all in the Second Amendment. I would say they're weak on the Second Amendment, and we have to be careful of that. You know, they call it the slippery slope, and all of a sudden everything gets taken away.
Welcome back. That was President Trump today with some familiar talking points on the issue of gun laws less than 2 weeks after he said he disagreed with the slippery slope logic. Today is just the latest in President Trump's apparent walkback on gun control. His shift is also offering an out to Republicans wary of gun legislation. Today, Politico reported this about Senator and Homeland Security Committee Chair Ron Johnson, quote, "I really don't see the dynamic having really changed there much," Johnson said, of an effort to strengthen background checks during gun sales, which generally polls at around 90%. "I don't anticipate we're going to pass a federal red flag law." Democratic Senator Chris Coons joins me now today. He called out the president for what he calls a failure of leadership on guns. Well, Senator, what do you make of the president and what he is saying now versus what he said a week ago? Do you believe he's shifted his position? Do you believe that from his standpoint, background checks are now off the table?
Well, Steve, this is part of the challenge of negotiating with President Trump on any difficult or controversial issue. As we've seen several times in the last 2 years, there will be a major incident, a mass shooting, a mass casualty, gun-related event, and he will initially sound very tough, very determined, very brave about whether it's bump stocks after the Las Vegas shooting or background checks after the Sutherland Springs shooting, or more recently saying we really need to do something about gun violence, and having great conversations, encouraging conversations with senators of both parties just 2 weeks ago. Now we're seeing him walk away from that. I think it's clear that only with presidential leadership, only with President Trump being willing to stand up to the NRA, will there be enough Republicans in the Senate for us to move something forward. Senator Toomey of Pennsylvania and I are co-sponsoring a NICS Denial Notification Act that would hopefully be a part of a package that would include strengthened background checks, the Toomey-Manchin bill, as well as the so-called red flag law that Blumenthal and Graham have been talking about. I've had conversations with all of these senators in the last 2 weeks. But at the end of the day, only presidential leadership will get this important work done. And from what you just played, Steve, I'm concerned he is once again walking back from an opportunity for real leadership on this issue.
Well, we played that clip, too. He said that he's having very meaningful, his words, they're very meaningful discussions with Democrats. You were saying, I think the word you just used was great discussion, great conversation 2 weeks ago. Mm-hmm. Have there been ongoing conversations? Has there been an ongoing dialogue between Democrats and the administration since then?
Yes, I believe there was a meeting last week. I was not able to attend it. At the White House with a half dozen legislators. I know there's been outreach by other members of the administration, and I got an update on that yesterday from Senator Manchin. My general sense is that they continue to explore what's possible, what's enactable. But, you know, frankly, the president has to lead here. The thing that will make the decisive difference is the president taking a point and sticking to it and saying, now is the time for us to finally strengthen background checks, for example, or to finally make a lasting difference in how emergency risk protection orders or so-called red flag laws are enacted in this country. I think we should do nothing less than the Toomey-Manchin bill, which strengthens background checks and adds several other proposed pieces of legislation like the bill I have with Pat Toomey that would make sure state and local law enforcement is notified if someone who is prohibited from getting a weapon, a convicted felon, for example, goes into a gun store and tries to buy. It's so-called lie and try legislation, where if you try to buy a gun as a person prohibited, state law enforcement would be notified. We need a strong package of several bills like that that would include the background check strengthening bill. But frankly, what's going to matter most is what position the president finally takes when we come back into session after Labor Day, and whether or not he's willing to stand up to the NRA.
Well, where he seems to be right now, to the extent you can discern this, it seems to be more enthusiasm on the president's part for a so-called red flag law. See again what the final readout is on background checks. But if the push from the administration is, hey, Congress, pass a red flag law, if the push from Republicans in the Senate is red flag law, is that something you could vote for if there were no other action on gun control? Or would you attach those two? Would you say I'm only going to vote for a red flag law if there's a vote on background checks?
I think we should have a vote on background checks if, at the end of the day, we only pass something like the Emergency Risk Protection Order bill. I think we have to be willing to look at making some progress in the face of the nationwide tragedy of repeated gun violence incidents. But frankly, this is also an important moment, Steve, for us to take a look at the yawning gulf between the proposals of every Democrat who's running for president and the willingness of this president, our current president, to take any tough stance. Joe Biden, who you know I support, has a very strong forward-leaning position on attacking gun violence. He, as one of the co-authors of the '94 crime bill, took on the NRA and was successful in getting an assault weapons ban passed back in the 90s. And I think every candidate in the Democratic side has stronger positions on background checks, on so-called red flag laws, on investing more in mental health, and in making sure we are doing everything we can to make our community safer than does our current president. So this is a special opportunity, an opening for the president to lead. We should take a vote on background checks, but frankly, we should also be willing to work across the aisle to make progress.
I'm curious what you think. You're a politician. You're surrounded. You work with politicians. Politicians do respond generally to their perceived political incentives. And when you look at the polling on background checks, this is something folks have been saying for years. This poll's at, I think, 90% is the number in our newest poll that cuts across both.
Overwhelming.
So I guess the question is, this isn't the first time background checks have sort of been on the table. I remember the Senate back in 2013. It got filibustered, but background checks were on the table then. The polling looked the same. The predictions from background check supporters back then were, hey, any senator that just blocks something that 90% of the public wants is going to pay a price. And none of them did. How come that 90% doesn't seem to translate into a political price for folks who defy it?
I would disagree that no one's paid a price. I will tell you that there are a number of particularly suburban districts and right here in the Pennsylvania area in Philadelphia, there are 4 suburban districts that were previously represented by Republicans and are today represented by freshman Democrats. And in all 4 of those districts, I think positions taken by the 2 parties on a willingness to take some action on background checks and gun control played a central role in those elections. I think it's partly why the House of Representatives is Democratic controlled at this point. What I've seen in polling, Steve, as you're referencing, is that a majority of Americans, a majority of Republicans, a majority of gun owners support responsible background check legislation. 90% of background checks through our NICS system are cleared in a minute or less. This is not an overly burdensome system. And it helps make sure that we keep guns out of the hands of people who shouldn't have them. And an incident after incident where law enforcement officers, as recently happened here in Philadelphia, are shot at or shot by individuals who should not have weapons. It just strengthens these calls for us to do a better job of enforcing the laws on the books and strengthening the laws on the books.
All right, Senator Chris Coons, Democrat from Delaware. Thank you for taking a few minutes.
Thank you.
Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor, subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Meet the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.